Hello, I'm Dr. John Cruz, and today, in honor of wrapping up the Olympics this week, I'm going to be talking about ADHD and exercise. So again, I'll be talking for about 20 minutes or less. If you have questions while I'm talking, you can certainly type them in and I will answer them at the end. And this will be posted on YouTube as well as on this Facebook channel later. So, and tying in with the Olympic tie-in, I'm going to throw in a personal disclaimer. No, I am not an Olympian, but I am a marathon runner. I've run 100 marathons, and I have trained more than several hundred novices to run their marathon for the first time. So I clearly have a bias in favor of promoting exercise, and both for its physical and mental health benefits. And there is a fairly robust and growing body of evidence for the benefits of exercise for mental health, starting with studies in the general population, so not people with any specific condition, but we can see that exercise has effects on boosting mood, on improving working memory, on improving a host of other executive functions, on decreasing impulsivity, and there are growing bodies of evidence that for treating full-blown clinical conditions, physical exercise can, at least in some individuals, be as potent as our medication approaches for things like depression, for anxiety. Constant or habitual exercise is at the top of almost every gerontologist's recommendations for staving off dementia, and there's a growing body of information on ADHD. Now, one thing about the studies I'll say is that in contrast to what we've been talking about some of the previous times with neuromodulatory devices, where there is a strong financial interest in a manufacturer making of this, that the exercise in ADHD literature almost falls the opposite direction. So this is something readily available, almost anyone can do it, and therefore there are fewer big pocket research or investors willing to invest in the research needed to demonstrate its efficacy. Doesn't mean there's no. And the other interesting thing is, again, in contrast to some of the other topics we've touched on recently, there are a few hundred articles out there about ADHD and exercise, but the vast majority of them are either commentaries or meta-analysis or distillations or speculations or anecdotal observations. So several of the meta-analyses that have been done in the last few years looked through 10 times as many papers before they could find a handful of good quality basic research articles to support a connection. So again, we certainly need more rigorous baseline informational studies. What we have is encouraging. And before I jump into the studies, I'm going to talk a little bit about so I'll be talking mostly about the effects of exercise on ADHD, but I do want to talk about the effects of ADHD on exercise. So there are a host of studies finding that particularly in this modern era, those people with ADHD are more likely to be sedentary, particularly children, have been studied. Children and adults with ADHD are more likely than the average, and the average keeps going up, to be obese and overweight. And some of the studies in children suggest that not only are children with ADHD more likely to be sedentary, but those children with ADHD who are most sedentary at a baseline measurement, when you look a few years later, are the ones more likely to either have severe, to at least persevere in having ADHD symptoms, or to have worsening of ADHD symptoms. So there's probably somewhat of a feedback loop we're dealing with here, that ADHD can contribute to lack of exercise, and lack of exercise can worsen ADHD. That's my contention. So what did the few dozen studies we have on ADHD and exercise show? Again, this is not a vast body of literature, but there's some good evidence that probably the best evidence is for fine motor control improves in children with ADHD who exercise regularly. There are studies supporting better attention in children with ADHD who exercise. There are studies that support better impulse control in those with ADHD who exercise. And how or where does this happen? I'll get into possible mechanisms in a minute, but some of the just observational data is that most of these studies are done acutely, so they're looking at have the kids run, swim, do judo, some other exercise. Running tends to be the most prominent just because it's easiest to standardize location to location. So they tend to have a controlled group. Everyone exercises, and then we look at the end of the control exercise, within minutes to an hour afterwards to see if there's been any improvement on attention, concentration, working memory, or other executive functions or aspects of ADHD. And again, most of these studies, and there have been a few that have not found positive results, but most of them show improvement after a single acute bouts of exercise. There's a tiny number of studies that actually made measurements while people were exercising. So some of them used treadmills and acoustic attention, so hearing exercises that you could do while you're on a treadmill, so you weren't needing to use your hands or respond physically in that way to doing complicated things that would be screwed up by working on a treadmill. So there is improvement on a treadmill in the moment you're on the treadmill in terms of both reaction time among kids with ADHD to auditory stimuli and with fewer omissions, so fewer mistakes from just missing the cue. And that was actually a study that showed that the control kids who didn't have ADHD went the opposite direction. They actually got a little worse, so they were a little slower and they made a little more mistakes. They missed more auditory cues, but the ADHD kids again got better. So at the end of the study, they looked much closer to a neurotypical population. So again, most of the studies are looking very shortly after exercise, and there are studies that are looking at habitual or long-term exercise, and actually the longer you do the exercise, the more robust the finding in the studies in terms of improvement of any of these executive functions for ADHD. So how might any of this help? Is it just a feel-good that we feel better, we look better, we fit into nicer clothes, and that improves mood, and that's all what's going on? Probably not. There are probably direct physiologic effects, and so what I'm going to be talking about next are some of the findings, not just from studies of exercise in kids with ADHD or adults with ADHD, but a little more broadly to the whole exercise in humans study. So one of the things that regular exercise does is boost angiogenesis. So angi is a fancy word for blood vessel growth, and particularly small capillaries in the brain. So if you increase blood flow consistently, if you increase oxygenation to the body, not just in the muscles, but other organs, including the brain, you stimulate the growth of tiny new blood vessels, and that goes on to sustain or continue greater nourishment, oxygenation to that tissue. And specifically, angiogenesis in the frontal cortex, which is one of the areas that's most impacted by ADHD, has been shown as a result of regular, simple walking exercise. Other things that exercise does, has been shown to do in the brain, is improve synaptogenesis. So that's, again, making more connections from one neuron to another. So synaptogenesis goes up with regular exercise. There's also evidence that brain-derived neurotrophic factors, and that's usually abbreviated as BDNF, and that means so brain-derived. These are substances produced within brain tissue. Neurotrophic is a fancy word for neurons, or the cells of the brain. Trophic means growing factors. So this is a chemical component made by brain cells that actually stimulates the growth of brain cells. And it both protects nerve cells from dying, and in some areas of the brain, maybe particularly some sets of the hippocampus, may stimulate new neurogenesis, new making of new brain cells. And again, exercise, and in both animals and humans, and running has been the behavior that's been most studied. The exercise behavior definitely boosts brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, and There's some evidence that that improves longevity of neurons that are already there and may improve generation of new nerve cells. Which is, again, particularly pertinent because there's a host of studies suggesting that those people with ADHD may have a paucity of nerves in certain parts, particularly prefrontal cortical sections. So that's sort of at the structural anatomic level. At the biochemical level, there are both acute, so immediate effects within minutes to hours of boosting dopamine, boosting norepinephrine, both in areas of the brain where cell bodies for these dopamine cells, so substantia nigra, norepinephrine cell bodies primarily in the locus ceruleus. There's increased norepinephrine dopamine levels there, but there are also where norepinephrine and dopamine are released, and again, particularly prefrontal cortex, evidence for improved boosts in norepinephrine and dopamine in prefrontal cortex, and that at least overlaps, if not identically mimics, some of what we think our stimulant medications and non-stimulant medications are doing to have direct benefits for ADHD. So in addition to the acute immediate effects on boosting norepinephrine, boosting dopamine, there seem to be longer-term sustained elevations of dopamine and norepinephrine, particularly in some of these prefrontal cortex areas as a result of regular exercise. And there's also evidence of more closely regulated norepinephrine tone in the locus ceruleus, and that's thought to contribute to I mentioned earlier, exercise seems to be particularly helpful for anxiety. So the thought is having more balanced, more well-regulated norepinephrine in the locus ceruleus makes you less susceptible to panic, makes you less likely to trigger a whole flight or fight response. And for many people with ADHD, it's not just a cognitive set of symptoms, but there is an emotional reactivity that's common. And if you are less prone to panic, less prone to being overwhelmed, that may well be a positive benefit of exercise in helping with sort of mood stability, which has impact for social stability and positiveness. And similarly, there's evidence that the amygdala is stabilized by changes chronically probably in norepinephrine and dopamine, and that the amygdala which is one of our brain centers for emotional reactivity is a shorthand, I'll say. If it becomes less reactive, again, you may be more resilient, more able to control your response, maybe less impulsive, maybe less. So that's some of the neurochemical evidence or potential benefits for how specifically exercise may help ADHD. And then there's some explanations that are at a more sort of global physical level. So some, even if full-blown running around in circles, hyperactivity isn't a manifestation of ADHD in many adults. A lot of adults still, fiddle with their pencil, bob their head, have their legs going all the time. So physical restlessness, fidgetiness. And one of the claims is if you just get that out of your system with the bout of physical activity, then your brain may be less distracted by your own hyperactivity later in the day. So clearly we haven't worked out all the mechanisms by which exercise may be helping, not just, again, brains in general, but specifically be a benefit to people with ADHD. Some of the big questions that are still unanswered is we do not know what the optimal duration. We do know that exercise, an aerobic exercise for a half hour, a few times a week, that is sufficient to have measurable effects. So again, we don't know what duration is optimal. We don't know frequency, how often you need to keep doing it. We don't know if there are types of exercise that are particularly good. So although some of the exercises or some of the studies on exercise looked at running or swimming or walking, which are repetitive, sort of simple behaviors, others looked at much more complicated, either yoga routines or judo, karate routines. specifically trying to engage coordination processes as well as aerobic conditioning processes. So it may be that particularly for some of the fine motor control or maybe some other, maybe a greater range of things, maybe it's important to bring in more than just a rote repetitive exercise that provides good aerobic conditioning. We don't know yet right now. That's all conjectural. We don't know whether it's best to keep doing the same thing over and over and get better and better at that, or whether it's better to mix and match. A few words of caution, so exercising caution here. Many people with ADHD in my office will relate histories of enthusiastically engaging in some form of exercise for weeks or months and then falling off the wagon with it and wishing that they had gotten back on it. So often, sometimes the very first few times, if there's a bad exercise, if a bad interaction, if you get too tired, if you feel too uncoordinated, if you don't feel up to your peers, that may dissuade people initially, but usually there's some initial enthusiasm that carries people along for several weeks or months. Ways, particularly with ADHD, to help sustain that and continue with it. One would be to tie it into your calendar, actually schedule it, put it down there, tie it into sleep, meals, other things that are happening constantly and habitually. Two would be to make it part of not just a physical exercise regimen, but part of a social interaction. So if you are going to the gym with a friend or jogging with a group, or that measurably seems to make it easier for most people to sustain. There's both the accountability to others and there's the positive feedback of doing something socially with others. And again, it may be good, there is a novelty seeking among many people with ADHD, so it may be just as good if you do switch to a different exercise activity, every 6 months or so, as long as you're doing something. We don't know yet. We don't have all that data. So that is about all I have to say for right now. Again, I'm seeing one question has come in, so I will pause in a moment and read it. Next week, I'll be talking about movement disorders, so Parkinsonism and some other diseases or conditions of movements that may be linked either to ADHD or to medications used to treat ADHD. And have a healthy, happy, even if you haven't started your exercise regimen yet, stay healthy. And I'll see you next week. Again, there is at least one comment. So it's not a question, it's just thanking me for the information, so I'm glad this is helpful and I'm delighted to have an appreciative audience. If you like what you found here, certainly feel free to share it either again through the Facebook channel or through the YouTube channel. The YouTube channel is under Dr. John Kruse, so DrJohnKruse, all one word on YouTube. So stay healthy, stay happy, and have a good week. Bye.